This is a recording from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. For more information, visit our website or YouTube channel.
Nico, as I mentioned, is our new VOX-Pol Fellow, about which more in a second. His work is going to really focus on analyzing Arabic language primary sources, particularly related to jihadist propaganda, both on and offline, and seeing the relationship between the two, I believe, is one of the more sort of pressing research concerns. Just very quickly about VOX-Pol, you can see some of the graphics up there. It is a 5-year EU-funded project, which we are part of, ICSR Kings, that is. And it is Europe-wide, and a number of academic institutions working together, bringing together political scientists, social scientists, and computer scientists to try and better understand this phenomenon of the use of the internet by by political extremist movements. And part of that project is the research that Nico will be undertaking with us for about a year. And he is going to discuss his research with us now, and I will leave it at that. Thanks, Nico.
Okay, well, thanks, Alex, and thank you all for being here. We'll dive right into the online territory, so to speak. I like to call them online territories because that, I think, is the way that jihadis prior to ISIS and with ISIS, peak of the iceberg for the time, consider the internet as a public space they seek to occupy on all levels and all channels by having a persistent existence and a persistent kind of role that they are filling with videos, pictures, and text. So it's ideology conveyed on a textual basis and also on an audio-visual basis. So the mix is you have online propaganda, but you shouldn't dismiss online propaganda as not taking it serious or as just ridiculing it, as has been happening in the past 10 years, of not taking it as a serious kind of way of conveying information that is being produced in the real world mainly and enters the online spheres. So it's a strong connection between on and offline and little to no disconnect, especially ISIS having territory where they can produce professional material 24/7 from a wide variety of topics from Syria to Iraq, but also increasingly from the Sinai Peninsula and Egypt in general and Libya. This disconnect is even more visible in terms of the information being put up online, coming from the offline real world framework. The time in between is getting smaller and smaller. So we'll have a look on how the Islamic State is using the internet, the self-proclaimed and so-called Islamic State, and how they operate and how they seek to project influence by consistently projecting an ideology that's very coherent. A practical example, if you can see here from the screen, is two individuals in Arabic ranting about the effect ISIS videos have. So that even Jabhat al-Nusra and Ahrar al-Sham are kind of feeling the competition and they're feeling they're in the losing grounds because they cannot cope with the amount and the quality of the professionally made ISIS videos. In one case, the Ahrar al-Sham person is saying that the videos affect the youth more than 1,000 times than any books or sermons can. And if you look at Al-Qaeda material, it's mainly textual. And if you look at Asawahiri speeches or other ideological kind of videos, it's mainly dominated by a guy speaking like right now, right here to you, without cool pictures and graphics. That's why I have lots of pictures for you in the presentation. When we talk about Syria in particular, you have to kind of understand the mobile aspects that we're dealing with. So the jihadist internet culture is very mobile and very self-efficient. The majority of us in this room probably have smartphones and have a 24/7 access to the online technologies with laptops and tablets and have maybe a desktop at home or not. But the point is, whatever we do in life these days, we have the possibility to connect with the internet if we choose. And jihadists in general move very similarly, especially in the Syrian context where you had a mobile culture before the Arab Spring and in Iraq it's a bit similar. So you have physical networks that are very localized, and you have global support networks that are mainly virtual. The content, the ideology, it's important to know, is highly coherent, and the mainly produced Arabic content coming from within ISIS-controlled territory can then be passed on, because it's public material and public data, via all social media outlets and channels, and then it can be picked up by, for example, support networks in the UK or in Germany or in Italy, and they, if they have the means to translate it from the Arabic to non-Arabic, you have a whole new set of data that is coherent and underneath the guidance of the propaganda and the ideology, but it's targeting a different audience. And ISIS understands this, I believe, in full, and that's why they're so keen in producing Arabic as a primary form of language, but they also use the foreign fighters to address their respective target audiences from within their countries of origin. So it's a wide range of data. Jihadi forums still matter, and all of the social media sites, and all, I mean, like every platform you use or every platform that you read about is being literally infested by this material. Social media in particular is a win-win situation. It's cheap to costing nothing. Individuals are highly dedicated. If the accounts get removed from Twitter, they just keep on coming back and coming back. Sometimes you see accounts even bragging about this in their description, saying this is my 50th account. So they're really dedicated, and they're being re-enabled by the network as a whole. So if Twitter deletes 1,000 accounts, but of course doesn't delete every single pro-ISIS account at once, because it's technically probably impossible, and core accounts keep coming back, then the support accounts will tweet and promote this account saying, this is Abu so-and-so, his account was removed, please support him by following him. So they regenerate their followings quite fast, sometimes within a few hours to a few days, depends. Propaganda is basically for everyone. There's something in store for everyone. You may have a passion for the more or less violent elements, or you may have a passion for the more civic services as being advocated by ISIS. So it's ranging from hardcore beheadings, which are in the context of being offered and conveyed to the audience, displayed as legitimate implementation of law, to pictures where ISIS fighters clearly say, I'm a terrorist, but I'm also a humanitarian. So the element of joining the Islamic State to fight for the defense and protection of Sunni population pockets or villages and towns is a very strong element that is mixed with violence. So you have hardcore violence on the one end, and on the other end you have a very prolific and a very sophisticated way of conveying that this is indeed a state-building project, and here are mujahideen putting down their arms to clear a street, to rebuild houses, to disseminate aid to Sunni refugees inside Syria, inside Iraq, and so on and so on. So they know how to deal with a number of elements and package that into the video. Unlike the Al-Qaeda videos, were mainly categorizable by genre. For example, someone delivering a sermon, a hostage video, or a sniper video, suicide bombing video. It would be different videos. And in the ISIS environment, this is one video featuring a wide range of different elements. So, and they tune in to the resonance among its audience online primarily, and adopt the propaganda to it. So if the feedback on Twitter, for example, is negative in one direction, you see a discussion about it, and you can feel how the media strategists try to listen to feedback and listen to the audience. And then again, it's different clusters. If you analyze or if you look at Arabic language videos intended for an Arabic or Arab audience, it sometimes differs gravely than to, let's say, German media language that's coming from German language foreign fighters aimed at the German language environment in Europe. So the extremists, or in this case the Sunni jihadists in particular, are very keen to issue a very specific interpretation that they seek to formalize religion that meets the ends they're conducting. They're using religion to further their own cause and to further their own kind of understanding. And as I mentioned before, the big advantage that ISIS has is that they have territory where they can implement their kind of mindset. So formalizing religion leads to a clear definition of right and wrong, a halal, haram kind of sentiment where individuals, I mean the local population in that case, will be subjected to a very specific Islamic law, rule, and on the other hand, they seek to reformat and change the way of life while providing a living and a real alternative to what's happening, in this case, in Syria. So it's an alternative to the rule of the Al-Assad regime, while at the same time it provides some comfort and some safety in the core ISIS territory where bombings have gone down, for example, where current fighting is not taking place. That's the places where they seek to build up a coherent infrastructure. And as I mentioned before, there's little to no disconnect between on and offline. What is being produced offline is being put on the internet, and also the local population is oftentimes encouraged or forced, yes, either way, to publicly watch ISIS propaganda films and videos. So they have public screenings, media points, hand out DVDs and USB sticks and thumb drives, and then interview the audience on their take of video XYZ, how they saw that and this element, and so on and so forth. And that adds to the overall kind of impact of the propaganda, because you have now a different tune and different wordings used by people who are watching this material, and then they talk about it in an approving way. So it's a widening of the propaganda content. That's something Al-Qaeda only achieves on a very limited basis, especially in Yemen. So if you briefly talk about the foreign fighters which are part of the cluster networks, which are part of ISIS samples, as I mentioned before, and I find this very significant, a lot of times the foreign fighters, independently how they're being deployed in the field, you have the classical soldiers, the classical combat men, so to speak. You have foreign fighters who explicitly wish to conduct suicide operations or bombing missions, or who simply are part of the media workers, the media mujahideen. But in any case, the foreign fighters express in their own words, and oftentimes in their preferred languages, which is not Arabic, their own very personal reasons why I've left France, why have I left Austria, why have I come and joined the Islamic State. And it's a very powerful way of making the ideology comprehensible and also very understandable, because they touch on theological principles but don't explain them, even if they were able to, in detail, because they seek to reach out to their communities back home. So it's a very different level, different degree. And all of this is part of the official kind of Islamic State propaganda channels and media. So you have a hybrid function. You have a mujahid who is fighting, and he is producing media because he's standing in front of the camera for the time being. And likewise, you have embedded mujahideen who's like a CNN war journalist going out with the troops, and would then produce specific videos in German, for example, for the respective audiences. The non-Arabic ISIS material is of different interest because, as I mentioned, it provides an insight into how individuals touch on the Arabic-dominated ideology and oftentimes use very specific keywords in Arabic to kind of promote and boost the ideology. And then you can follow up in the keywords and contextualize these in the overall ideology, going back and forth from videos to texts. And this is more like a linguist approach, but it's very important because in Arabic you can convey big and very comprising, especially theological concepts, by just having one word or two words. So it's a different take on how the language works. It's a question of identity. What does it mean being a Sunni Muslim? We often see a clear dissociation from the country of origin. and a clear pledge of allegiance to Abu Bakr or to God in that way. It's a similar way. So you exchange loyalty to from one state to another. It's a talk about citizenship, citizenry, and in the ISIS context, a lot of this material is being projected in a visual basis, which targets a different set of people. Al-Qaeda was more like read this and understand, but the impact is much greater and graver when you have such a fluid way of producing videos and pictures. And then you have a feedback. You have videos being produced, it's being watched, people post pictures of their children watching a video, individuals and non-Arabic claiming their take on ideology, tweet about it. So it's a massive increase of data in general, which is happening without end. Individuals from videos like Abu Zar al-Bahraini from Bahrain has his own Twitter account. It gets picked up, it gets promoted by the fanboys, support networks, and also by the core people who are actually members of the Islamic State. And you see it's a constant kind of output that's going on. The camera is very important. We are, smartphone, professional, or in the field. But in the meantime, for about over a year now, I would say all of the official IS videos are produced in full HD, 16:9 quality, and in the meantime, we're talking about 4 to 8 videos per day coming from inside the territories, Syria and Iraq, and increasingly now Libya and Egypt, Sinai Peninsula in particular. So you can argue that ISIS has a practicality versus Al-Qaeda's seniority in terms of still being the ideological kind of heavyweights. ISIS, it's a win-win for ISIS because they take and use the texts all the way back from the 80s to now, and then show how they're being implemented, how ideology is being used on a practical everyday basis. It's combat and media. It's building a state and being ready to sacrifice and die for this. It's about an altruistic cause. It covers humanitarian issues, and it defines a clear set of rules of engagement when fighting the true enemies of Islam, which comprise of a wide range, from the outside forces, oftentimes determined as the Crusader forces, to the interior enemies, the Shiites and the Sufis, and so on and so on. So the media works in terms of that. A combat operation is part of the jihad as much as any kind of media production, because it's about conducting missionary work by promoting the cause and being ready to die for it. And very important, especially in the Syrian Iraqi context, is the eroding of borders that were set by Sykes-Picot, and the documentation thereof by IS individuals has a very strong and very deep-rooted impact, because Al-Qaeda was claiming to fight for the establishment of an Islamic State or a caliphate. It was always claiming it will tear down the artificial borders between the Islamic countries, but it never succeeded. And now ISIS is coming in, and it has achieved this means of a huge propaganda success, and it can instill the belief in people that it's possible to tear down artificial borders and implement the true Islamic interpretation that has been banned and prohibited by interior and exterior forces. Just very briefly, how do jihadi media dignitaries consider the use of the internet in their own kind of words? They approve and fully appraise and understand and value the impact the outreach has in all languages, so they can compete with Islamic legitimate mainstream schools of thought and Arabic mainstream media. And then if you move away from Arabic to other non-Arabic languages, it's a similar kind of take. It's about reducing the space to actual mujahideen, to actual fighters, because they are online likewise and are accessible and can be interviewed and dealt with. So they clearly outline the missionary work and the frontiers, from the war zones, from the front itself, and value any support networks they have in the hinterland or even within non-Islamic majority societies. So this is where non-Arabic languages become so interesting. The Islamic State, formerly known as the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham, so to speak, and I'll be quite brief about this. As you know, it's the successor from the Islamic State in Iraq that had a similar similar wording and ideology, naturally, that had a same to similar motivation when they declared its establishment some years ago. It considers itself as being the only protectors of Sunni communities in Syria, in Iraq, different dynamics, different frameworks, but in general it's the same kind of motivation and core element that they promote and project, especially with a long-standing historical list of grievances in the Al-Anbar province, fighting against the Americans, suffering under Muqtada Assad in Fallujah, and so on. And in Syria, if you recall the 1982 massacre of Hama, where the Syrian regime was shelling Hama into obliteration. And it's about implementing Sharia law while fighting for the oneness of God, for the principle of Tawheed. So the oneness of God, as stated in Islamic creed, is there's no God but God, and Muhammad is his messenger. And it's a very deep-rooted theological concept that is embedded in all the rituals and forms of prayers. And that's something in Syria you could not openly manifest because you would have been putting yourself on the radar of the Syrian regime, and likewise in Mubarak's Egypt and so on. So finally, so to speak, you have a lobby that's openly is fight for spaces in public, in the offline public, where you can manifest to profess the true unity of God. And that is why ISIS is so keen on destroying graves, holy sites, the burial sites of saints. That's why they're destroying the cultural heritage in Iraq at the moment of the Assyrians in Nimrod, Nakhata, and other places, because in their mindset, this is a violation of God, of the unity, of the oneness and unity of God, because these cultures and the people believed in being like two deities or a number of deities, and hence they would become those who associate something next to God, yet and hence violating the very principle of Tawheed. It's a very powerful narrative, if you will, and it works especially now that you have an Iranian existence, an Iranian presence, and boots on the ground in both in Syria and Iraq that kind of promotes this element. And from this like engulfing element, they build up a lot of other related mechanisms. So the Harb Ta'ifi is a reference to sectarianism, sectarian war, and they're using sectarianism for their own benefits, just as the Assad regime is doing as well. So the people of Syria in particular are torn apart between having to choose between Assad, the Shiite militias, or ISIS, or other radical factions, and oftentimes don't have a chance. We talk about content. There's a lot of content. It's an ongoing, around-the-clock kind of effort as we speak and sit here. We're missing new ISIS material being put out. It's a minutely dissemination basis, especially on Twitter. To give you a very brief example of what's happening, what is the content about? We have testimonies of suicide bombers, as I mentioned, people who, like the 9/11 hijackers, their testimony was videotaped and it was made public after the attack. If you imagine that you have more suicide bombs on a daily basis nowadays, so you have much more testimonials in Arabic and other languages. It also includes recommendations by regular fighters who give out advice to various target audiences. For example, you have Tunisians that give out advice to their Tunisian brothers in a very Tunisian context, addressing the different set of grievances and a different set of related elements than the Lebanese or the Iraqis or the Jordanians would kind of exercise. One core element these days is about executions and confessions. It was formerly in Syria, it became quite big in terms of quantity and quality when a number of Shabiha, of Assad's paramilitary henchmen were arrested by ISIS and also by non-ISIS people. And these are the individuals who went to villages to kill people, sometimes in a very gruesome and a very personalized way by using knives and cutting people open. And such confessions and subsequent executions have a certain popularity, especially within networks where people are traumatized and have suffered and or endured such an experience, or when they're coming from a village that was affected by a massacre or have lost people. It's about human nature, and you and I, we don't know how we would react to such videos if we had this personal link and relationship. So, and now with what's happening in Iraq, you have a lot of videos on a daily basis that show the confession and execution of alleged Shiites, spies spying for the Iranians, spying for the Iraqi government, spying for this and that service, that work from the inside of ISIS against ISIS. So it's a double win in that regard in terms of claiming we're having an effective counterintelligence unit that identifies such spies. We implement Islamic law in their perception on them, and at the same time, of course, they're claiming to be winning the war on a number of levels. In particular, in Syria, in 2012 onward, with the presence of Shiite foreign fighters coming from Iraq, from Lebanon, Hezbollah moving from Lebanon into Syria, aiding the Syrian Arab Army and the Shabiha and other forces, and the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps coming into Syria. A lot of the video material was focusing on the proof that indeed it's an Iranian war against the Sunnah. It's the Iranian hegemony it seeks to kind of gain and exercise and to destroy the Sunni communities from within and from without. And a number of propaganda elements were put up. For example, killed Hezbollah fighters from Lebanon were documented, and their passports to paradise issued by Nasrallah and other leaders were held up in the camera to promote what's happening and to kind of head on into a battle for survival between the two most extremist ideologies, one from the Shiite, one from the Sunnis. So I got a couple of graphic images for those of you who are non-initiated in terms of, for those of you who have not seen much of ISIS material, just to give you a very brief glimpse on how the propaganda works and how they kind of mix and mingle psychological elements into their understanding of religious sources mixed with practical experiences from the field, documenting the aftermath after a battle, for example. Especially for ISIS, Abu Musa al-Zarqawi is the ultimate role model. So his actions and his pioneer media work, if you will, that included the public execution of members of the Iraqi Interior Ministry, as you can see here some 10 years ago, is something that ISIS takes as a very sophisticated role model and that they reincorporate. You can see here in Arabic it says implementing the rule of law on the apostates. So it's a deep-rooted concept. The rule of law is clearly defined, and the implementation upon the apostates in this sense means that those being shot in the back of the head are Sunnis, but because of them wearing the Iraqi uniform, they have dissociated themselves from God and have become members of the Iraqi government, and as such are clearly defined and legitimate targets to be killed and executed. Some members or some sympathizers online are calling to reenact and relive out the days of Zarqawi. You see here layouts of executions and eulogizing of Zarqawi in a very kind of visualized way, a lot of fandom, a lot of kind of Photoshop material that's then being put out. And in this case, you have a bandana that was found in Syria. This guy is an ISIS fighter who holds up the bandana saying, "Ya Zainab, Ya Zainab," which is a clear Shiite slogan, and then he claims, we're not just fighting the Syrian Arab army, but we're fighting individuals from Iran who are being indoctrinated, who are being guided, like the Sunni jihadis seek themselves to guide by very specific religious interpretations. And here you have the Khomeini's, another body termed as an apostate. You have the books and writings from Iran that were found among the bodies of the apostates, and so on. And this all translates down into what you see here, and that is a very coherent understanding and a legitimacy of killing people, because it's based on the principle of an eye for an eye, because the way the propaganda works will lead the audience into accepting violence as morally justifiable, because the overall package is providing a lot of different elements that makes violence a necessity and obligatory. So it's about a jihadi lifestyle. Here you see a portion from the Quran. It's being fierce against the disbelievers, but passionate among them. So between the Sunni brothers, between the Sunni communities, there's love and passion. And it's a clear line of demarcation to anyone who is not subscribing to this very specific mindset. He or she will then be not defined and understood as a Sunni Muslim. And it's about promoting a very specific identity and a very specific jihadi lifestyle, with especially the Shiites being an eternal threat that is punishable by death on a number of different kind of rulings and explanations, while unfortunately this also has an impact on diaspora communities. We can feel and sometimes a growing distrust or mistrust among Sunni and Shiite communities, and ISIS, being so media keen and aware, seek to use this to their advantage as well. And in the immediate neighborhood, of course, you have the impact. For example, last year's bombing in Lebanon, targeting the Iranian embassy in Beirut, or the Iranian Cultural Institute. It's all part of this kind of logic. So as I mentioned, the audiovisual and the written content needs to be understood as one element, and it needs to be kind of dealt and analyzed with as one. In the ISIS environment, there's a focus on having a visual output, and it leads to new clusters of information that may or may not be directly connected. It's a huge data influx, and the users are not just being active on Twitter, but they use Google+, Facebook, Instagram, the classical forums, old school kind of blogs and websites that are more statical. It's more about putting content up but not having interaction. Interaction is taking place on Twitter and so on and so forth. And they're very keen to adapt to new medias as well. So we're arguing that propaganda is as clusters, but it's a coherent ideology, it's resilient and highly decentralized. And the majority of people behind it have a connected fluidity to their devices within ISIS territory as well, and it's being picked up and kind of copycatted and promoted by networks, support networks outside of the ISIS territories. So very quickly, it's a win-win. You have a spillover from Arabic propaganda into non-Arabic. It's Twitter, you can use hashtags and keywords. Facebook, likewise, you can quickly find profiles and groups. If you use Google, oftentimes the Google search results will turn up with the most radical sites first. And on Google Plus, you have a combination of YouTube and Twitter, and has a very high outreach. But the main talk and the main important kind of network is still on Twitter. To give you a very brief kind of, how much time do we have?
5-10 minutes.
Okay. A very brief example is a video was published some time ago. You can look it up on the Jihadika blog. The video was published by an ISIS media account and was retweeted over 30,000 times within about 24 hours. And you see here the primary platform used to tweet and redisseminate was Twitter for Android, and then followed by Twitter for iPhone, and then the classical web interface came. So it's a very mobile culture. This is a network analysis of the 32,000 tweets. At the time, published by one Twitter account, which was removed and hasn't even come back, because nowadays they would just use a random account and the hashtags and send it out and have a similar impact and effect. In during the time of the Westgate mall attack in Nairobi, different data set, much smaller, but if you see a different environment, what mattered in that context was still the classical web interface, because it's a different environment, not so mobile, not so many people have mobile phones who were supporting Al-Shabaab, and hence a different set of data sets. So, just to give you a very brief example, it's a very specific asceticism and iconography. They use all the elements of nasheed, of a cappella style songs to enhance the videos, to enhance the message. In Arabic, you often come across the concept of haqq and batil, which seeks to outline a clear line of demarcation. We are the truthful Muslims who profess the unity of God. We are the muwahideen, versus those who are being corrupted by palace scholars or outside interests, and so on and so forth. It's about activating worshippers versus an idle state of the Sharia, which in their mind is an idle state of Islam. Certain elements such as an obligation to help and to support, to come to people in times of need, is being used likewise along the concept of an eye for an eye, which you have in every monolithic religion. And they're very good in this form of providing identification and translating motivation into action, which again is being videotaped and put out online. So for example, this is a document from 2008 touching on the theological kind of responses needed to deal with the reality of American drone strikes in the Syristan and Pakistan in general. And then it's a similar motivation that Ado Boulage was talking about, that was promoted by Yemeni's Inspire magazine in English to justify the killing of Lee Rigby in London. And you can see here the Boston bombing is kind of contextualized in a very similar framework. So this is a very easy way to navigate and make their ideology and motivation comprehensible. But if you dig into detail and if you dig into the Arabic side of things, it's a very deep-rooted, well-established, very coherent ideology that is very difficult to deactivate, I believe. So it's about state building, winning hearts and minds. As I mentioned, it's a mix of humanitarian clusters fighting for the proper Islam, ensuring Sunni rituals, forms of prayers, rites, norms, then to be taken over by ISIS, to be reformatted, being hijacked, being used in their own understanding and under their hegemonical use of interpretation. So it's oftentimes you have mixed narratives, and we need to talk about addressing the mix of the aesthetical visual element that is so deeply rooted and expression of the textual content. And this is a very nice example. You see here the typical kind of cluster of ISIS information or ISIS propaganda in Homs in Syria, handing out printed textbooks to school children or the next generation of the soldiers of the caliphate, as they often like to call them. So when we go online and we have all this data and we see a lot of content being put up, we should not forget that, as Tracy Lanier was saying, digital information is really just people in disguise. And I kind of agree with that. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Nico.
This was a recording from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. For more information, visit our website or find us on SoundCloud.